The Eternal Thirst by Edgar Morrigan. Chapter 1. The Waking Drought. The town of Aylmsford had always been a place of quiet charm, a town of winding cobbled streets, stone cottages with thatched roofs, and a bustling square where neighbors greeted each other like old friends. But now, the town felt more like a shell of itself, an empty echo of the vibrant community it once was. The drought had stretched on for years, and with it, a creeping sense of unease had taken root in the hearts of Aylmsford's residents. At first, it had been nothing more than a simple inconvenience, a summer that felt too long, a crop that didn't yield enough, a well that ran dry sooner than it had the year before. But with each passing season, the water dwindled further, the streams running low, and the rain never coming. And though the weather seemed relentless in its dryness, something darker was at play, something no one dared to speak of aloud. Sarah Dunsford, a woman in her mid-30s, stood by the window of her cottage, her hands resting on the cool sill. Her eyes traced the horizon where the sun was beginning to set, casting an orange hue across the barren fields. The land, which had once been green and thriving, was now cracked and parched. Even the trees seemed to have surrendered, their leaves dry and brittle. The thirst was everywhere. In the cracks of the earth, in the shallow wells, in the hollow eyes of the townspeople who moved through the streets like shadows of themselves. It had become a part of life. People no longer spoke of the drought directly. It was as if to say the word would somehow make it worse. The town had simply learned to endure, to carry the weight of the thirst without acknowledging it. Sarah had lived in Aylmsford her whole life, raised by her parents in this very cottage. She had watched as the drought slowly consumed her world, a silent force that neither fought nor surrendered. But lately, there was something new in the air. It was subtle, like a shift in the wind, something just out of reach, but undeniable. She felt it in her bones, the way the air felt thick, as if the drought was no longer the only thing that had changed. And then he arrived. It was late afternoon when the stranger first appeared, his silhouette cutting through the heat haze like a figure from a forgotten dream. At first, Sarah thought he was just another wanderer, another lost soul searching for a place to rest. But the townsfolk were used to travelers passing through. Rarely did anyone stay. It had been years since anyone new had made the trek to Aylmsford. She watched him from the window as he walked down the empty street, his steps slow but purposeful. His clothes were dark, strange, too formal for such a desolate place. His hair was jet black, falling to his shoulders in thick waves, and his eyes, when he glanced upward for the briefest of moments, were a shade of violet so deep it almost looked unnatural. He wasn't like the others who had come and gone. There was something about him that felt wrong. Curiosity pulled Sarah out of her cottage, her feet moving before her mind could catch up. She didn't know what she expected. Perhaps he would ask for water or directions. Perhaps he would simply pass through as all the others did. But the moment she stepped outside, the air seemed to shift. A strange chill swept through the street, a coldness that made her skin prickle. The stranger stopped in front of her house, his eyes locking onto hers as if he had been expecting her all along. A knowing smile played at the corner of his lips, but it wasn't the kind of smile that offered comfort. It was a smile that carried with it the weight of things unsaid, of secrets long buried. "Good evening," he said, his voice smooth like velvet, but there was something dark beneath it, something that set Sarah's nerves alight. "Evening," Sarah replied cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest as she met his gaze. "Can I help you?" The stranger tilted his head slightly, as though he were considering her question carefully. "I've heard about this town," he said, his voice low. A town that has been waiting for something. The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Waiting for something, she asked, unsure if she was hearing him correctly. He smiled again, but this time, the smile didn't reach his eyes. Yes, he said softly, waiting for the one thing that will quench its thirst. Sarah's skin crawled. She felt the words settle into her mind, like a weight that refused to lift. "We're not thirsty," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "We've learned to live with it." The stranger didn't respond immediately. He simply stood there, watching her with an intensity that made her uneasy. The silence between them stretched long, and the longer she looked at him, the more she felt like something was wrong, something deep and dangerous. He wasn't just a traveler, he was something more. "I'm afraid," he said after a long pause, "that your town has been mistaken. You are thirsting for more than water." A shiver ran down Sarah's spine, but before she could respond, he turned and began walking away, his footsteps fading into the distance. "I'll be seeing you soon," he called over his shoulder. Sarah stood there for a long time, unable to move, her mind racing. Who was he? What did he mean by that? And why did it feel like his words had reached into the very heart of Aylmsford, speaking a truth that no one dared acknowledge? As the last light of the day slipped behind the horizon, Sarah's thoughts were consumed with that one simple phrase. "You are thirsting for more than water." In the growing darkness, she felt the weight of the drought press in even closer, and the fear that had been slowly building inside her now gripped her heart. A new kind of thirst had come to Aylmsford, and it was one that could not be quenched by mere rain. Chapter 2: Whispers in the Dust. The next few days passed in an unsettling silence. It was as though the air itself had grown heavy, laden with something unseen but palpable. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed since the stranger's visit, something in the very essence of Aylmsford. She would glance down the cobbled streets, half expecting to see him again, but he never appeared. The town carried on as it always had, the residents moving in slow, tired motions, their eyes hollow, faces devoid of expression, but the words he had spoken to her echoed in her mind like a lingering melody, one that refused to be ignored. "You are thirsting for more than water." More than water. The thought lingered, cold and unnerving. Sarah had known drought. She had known the land to wither, the crops to fail, the wells to dry. But this was something different, something insidious. It wasn't just the soil that was thirsty, it was the people, too. She saw it in their eyes. The desperation. The emptiness. They weren't just thirsty for rain. They were thirsting for something they couldn't name. The townsfolk had stopped talking about the drought entirely. It had become a subject too familiar, too worn. Even at the market, where there was once lively chatter, there was now only a hushed silence, as if people were afraid to voice their growing suspicions aloud. The young, withered faces of children who should have been laughing were now empty, their lips parched and cracked, eyes wide with a quiet hunger. Sarah passed by Thomas Fairchild, the town's blacksmith, who stood at his forge, his hammer striking the metal rhythmically, though the sweat on his brow never seemed to give way to a moment of comfort. She caught his eye, and for a brief moment, he looked at her with a strange, knowing sadness. "You should be careful," he said, his voice rough, like the scrape of metal on stone. "The drought's not the only thing creeping through this town." Sarah frowned. "What do you mean?" Thomas glanced over his shoulder, as though checking for eavesdroppers. The square was nearly empty, but there was an aura of discomfort in the air, like the very earth was listening. He lowered his voice, almost to a whisper. There's talk. People saying things about what happens when you can't quench your thirst. There's a darkness lurking here now. Something more than the drought. Something hungry. Hungry? Sarah repeated, her heart tightening in her chest. You think it's something supernatural? He shook his head, his expression grim. I don't know what it is. But I know this, it's been getting worse. People don't sleep. They wander in the dark, eyes wide open. They hear things at night. Things that shouldn't be there. Thomas paused, his hand still holding the hammer, but his eyes lost focus, as if seeing something far beyond the square. And that stranger. He's not just passing through. I saw him walking the streets late last night. Watching us. Sarah's pulse quickened, her breath catching in her throat. The same stranger. The one who had spoken those words to her. He's a part of it, isn't he? She asked, barely above a whisper. I don't know, Thomas replied. But whatever he is, he's not the only thing we should fear. There's something else, Sarah. Something that's been here all along. It's just waiting. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. Thomas's words felt like a warning, like a crack in the town's fragile veneer of normalcy. She had heard the stories as a child, tales of cursed lands, of shadows that crept through the cracks, of a town that once drank from a well so deep that it never ran dry. But those were just stories, weren't they? Fables told by the elders to keep the children close, but now, standing in front of Thomas, the weight of his words felt too real to ignore. I've got to go, she said, the urgency in her voice betraying the unease she felt in her bones. As she turned to leave, she heard Thomas's voice behind her, calling her name softly. Don't go looking for answers in places you're not ready to find. Sarah didn't stop to respond. She didn't want to. She didn't know what Thomas meant, but something in the tone of his warning made her uneasy. That night, she found herself restless. Sleep had eluded her, and she tossed and turned in the small bed she had once found so comforting. The house seemed too quiet, too still. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind against the walls, sounded amplified in the dead of night. She pulled the covers tighter around her, her mind racing with thoughts of the stranger, of Thomas's warning, of the strange unease that had settled over Elmsford. At some point, she must have drifted off, though the sleep was shallow and fragmented, filled with strange dreams of endless deserts, cracked earth, and dry lips. She dreamt of a figure in the distance, a silhouette against the burning sun, always just out of reach. When she tried to call out, her voice came out in a dry whisper, her throat cracked and parched. Suddenly, she was awake, her heart pounding. The house was eerily quiet, save for the wind howling through the cracks in the windows. But it wasn't the wind that had woken her. It was the sound, faint at first, but unmistakable. The sound of something moving in the dark. A soft, wet sound. Sarah froze. She strained her ears, trying to decipher the noise. It came again, a scraping sound against the wood, like something or someone scratching at the door. She sat up in bed, holding her breath, waiting for the sound to come again. There was nothing, just the wind, and then, just as she was about to dismiss it as a figment of her imagination, the door to her bedroom creaked open. Chapter 3: The Thirst That Lies Beneath. Sarah's heart stopped for a moment as the door creaked open. Her breath caught in her throat. The house had been silent just moments before, the wind howling its usual mournful tune through the cracks in the windows. But now, something felt wrong. It wasn't just the silence, it was the presence, the feeling of something close, something unseen, just beyond her reach. She stayed still, listening, straining her senses to detect any sound, any movement that would give her a clue as to what had opened the door. The dim moonlight filtered in through the cracks in the shutters, casting long shadows across the floor. The room was cold, colder than it should have been, despite the warmth of the summer night. Another creak, this time from inside the room. Sarah's pulse quickened. She couldn't tell if the sound was coming from the door itself or from somewhere deeper within the house. It was as if the walls themselves were breathing, exhaling the chill of something ancient, something buried. She reached for the bedside lamp, her fingers trembling as she grasped the cold metal. The moment the light flickered on, the room seemed to shift. The shadows deepened, pressing against the corners of the walls, thickening as if trying to swallow the small pool of light she had created. The door hung ajar, but there was no one there. Her mind raced. Could it have been the wind? Had she imagined the creaking? It was late, and the house was old. Old houses had a way of making strange sounds. But she knew, deep down, that this was different. This was something else. She stood slowly, her legs weak beneath her, and made her way toward the door. Every step felt heavy, as though the very floor was reluctant to bear her weight. Her breath was shallow as she reached for the door, half expecting something to grab her hand, to pull her into the dark. But nothing came. With a quick motion, she pushed the door fully open. The hallway outside was dark, the air thick and stagnant. The familiar scent of dust and wood lingered in the air, but there was something else now, a faint, bitter odor, like something decaying. She stepped into the hallway, her bare feet cold against the floorboards. The door to the guest room stood across from hers, slightly ajar as well. Sarah hesitated before walking toward it, her mind racing with every possibility. What if someone had broken in? What if it was the stranger? Was he somehow inside the house now? Her mind spun with images of the man, the strange, unsettling smile on his face, the cryptic words that hung in the air. But as she reached for the guest room door, she heard it, a low sound, like a groan, coming from behind it. It was unmistakable, her breath caught in her throat. Something or someone was in the room. With trembling hands, Sarah pushed the door open. The room was empty. The bed was untouched, the window cracked open just a sliver, letting in the cool night air. Yet the groan, that unsettling noise, lingered in the silence. It came again, louder now, almost like a gasp for air, dry, desperate, hungry. Sarah's stomach turned. The air felt thick with it, the dryness almost suffocating. She turned quickly, retreating down the hallway, her mind racing with confusion and fear. What was happening? Why was the air so thick, so heavy with something she couldn't name? Then she saw it in the corner of the hallway. At the far end, a shadow moved. It was small, quick, almost imperceptible at first. But when Sarah blinked, it was there again, this time clearer, more distinct. The shadow moved slowly, slithering along the floor like something alive. She backed away, her heart pounding. The house had grown colder, the very air thick with a presence that felt unnatural. Her throat was dry, her mouth parched as she turned to retreat back into her bedroom. She slammed the door behind her, locking it with a trembling hand, but the unease didn't leave. It followed her, lingering in the corners of her mind, whispering that something was wrong, something terrible, and then, she heard it, the whisper, faint at first, like the rustling of dead leaves, but growing clearer as it slipped into her consciousness. Thirst. The voice was hollow, like the echo of someone long dead. It wasn't from outside the door. It was inside her head. Thirst. The word repeated, as though it were crawling through the walls, seeping into the very fabric of the house. Her body went rigid with the sound. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block it out, but it grew louder, filling the room, drowning out all other thoughts. She couldn't escape it. There was no place where it wouldn't follow. Thirst. The voice grew more desperate, frantic, as if the very walls of the house were speaking, crying out for something, something Sarah didn't understand, something terrible that the town had forgotten but could never escape. A memory flashed in her mind, a distant, half-forgotten story her grandmother had told her long ago. A tale of a town cursed by an ancient hunger, a thirst that couldn't be satisfied, no matter how much the people drank. The thirst, the story said, didn't just come for the body, it came for the soul. And once the thirst had taken root, there was no escape. Sarah's breath quickened. Her skin crawled with the realization. She had thought the drought was the worst of it. But this was something else. Something far darker. She felt the first stirrings of fear deep in her chest, like a pressure building from the inside. She knew what the town had been thirsting for, what it had needed for so long, and she knew, in that moment, that it wasn't just water. It was blood. Chapter 4. The Tainted Well. The next morning, Sarah woke to the relentless sound of the wind. The house groaned as though the very foundations were shifting under the weight of something old, something forgotten. She had barely slept, her dreams twisted with shadows and whispers of thirst that never ended. Her throat was dry, parched, as though the very air had conspired to steal the moisture from her body. She rose from the bed, her legs weak beneath her, as though sleep itself had become a distant memory. The house was still cold, the walls steeped in a silence that felt suffocating. The whispers had not stopped, they lingered in the corners of her mind, like a constant hum she couldn't escape. With a deep breath, she pulled herself together. She couldn't afford to fall apart. Not now. Not with everything that was happening in Aylmsford. She dressed quickly, the familiar motions of putting on her clothes a small comfort in the midst of the overwhelming uncertainty that weighed on her. As she moved through the house, she glanced at the old wooden clock in the hallway. The time seemed to stretch in the quiet, the seconds slipping by as though time itself was no longer playing by the rules. It was as if the hours had begun to lose their meaning, to fade into the same shadow that hung over the town. Sarah made her way to the kitchen, hoping the mundane task of preparing something to eat would give her mind a reprieve. But even as she went through the motions of preparing breakfast, her thoughts kept drifting back to the strange occurrences of the previous night. The shadow in the hallway. The voice, the whispering hunger. The stranger who had come to town and left a trail of unease in his wake. The morning light filtered weakly through the windows, but it didn't seem to reach into the corners of the room, as though the darkness held the house in a vice grip. She glanced out the window, her eyes scanning the dusty streets of Aylmsford. There was no sign of life yet, no children playing, no merchants setting up shop. The town seemed even more still than usual. As she sipped her water, she found herself unable to swallow properly. The dryness in her throat had only grown worse with the passing hours. The water tasted foul, bitter, as though something had soured it. But she pushed the thought away. The drought had taken its toll, she reasoned. The town's well had been running low for weeks. They were all living on borrowed time. Suddenly, a knock on the door broke her reverie, loud and insistent. Her pulse quickened. She hadn't been expecting anyone. Slowly, cautiously, she approached the door and opened it. Standing there, on the threshold, was Thomas Fairchild. He looked as though he hadn't slept at all. His eyes were sunken, and his clothes were slightly disheveled. His face, usually hard and weathered, was now drawn with lines of worry. He didn't speak at first, only stepped inside, his eyes darting around the room nervously. "Sarah," he said, his voice low. "I need to talk to you." She stepped back to allow him inside, closing the door behind him with a soft click. "What's wrong, Thomas?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "You look like you haven't slept." He ran a hand through his graying hair, a gesture of helplessness. "It's the town. It's all falling apart." Sarah's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" "The drought's one thing," Thomas said, pacing the room. "But that's just the surface. Something darker is happening here. People are losing themselves. Not just to thirst, but to something else. Something much worse." "What do you think it is?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression grim. "I've been to the well, Sarah. The one on the outskirts of town." The words struck her like a blow to the chest. "The well? What's wrong with the well?" Thomas hesitated, his eyes flickering with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "I don't know exactly, but I think it's cursed." Sarah felt a chill crawl up her spine. She knew of the well, of course. It had been the lifeblood of the town for generations. It had always been there, just beyond the edge of the fields, a steady source of water even during the harshest droughts. But lately, people had stopped talking about it. No one had bothered to visit it, not since the drought had worsened. "Cursed," she repeated, her voice catching in her throat. He nodded. "I went there this morning, and I saw something I shouldn't have. The water, it's not just dry. It's something else. Something is feeding off it, Sarah. Something dark, something that's been lurking beneath the surface for as long as the town has existed. I think it's the source of the thirst. It's feeding the town's hunger." "Feeding? What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her heart racing. "It's not just the land that's thirsty," he said, his voice trembling. "The people are. The well, it's become something else. Something alive. And it wants more. It wants everything." Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the full weight of his words sank in. The well, the source of life in the town, had become something unnatural. Something hungry. It wasn't just thirst that plagued Aylmsford, it was something deeper, something that gnawed at the very soul of the town. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice a whisper. Thomas looked at her, his eyes filled with fear. "We have to go to the well. We have to find out what's really down there. But I'm not sure we'll make it out alive, Sarah. If the thirst is what I think it is, it's too late." The air in the room seemed to thicken, the oppressive weight of the town's curse hanging heavy between them. Sarah swallowed hard, her throat dry as dust. She had thought the drought was the worst of it, but now she understood this wasn't about water anymore. This was about something darker, something that had been waiting for a chance to rise again, and now it was awake. Chapter 5: The Dark Descent. The sun was a faint, ghostly outline in the sky, casting a pale, sickly light over Aylmsford as Sarah and Thomas made their way toward the well. The town had not changed much since she first arrived, the same dilapidated buildings, the same cracked streets, but something was different now. The weight of the air had shifted. It pressed in on her chest, suffocating her. Thomas walked ahead of her, his pace steady but cautious. He kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting something to spring out from the shadows. The closer they got to the edge of town, the more oppressive the silence became. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. The town felt like a forgotten relic, abandoned to the ravages of time and thirst. "The well is just up ahead," Thomas said, his voice low, almost strained. It's not like it was when I was a boy. I don't know what happened, but something's been stirring there for years." They passed the last of the town's crumbling houses, the buildings growing sparse as they neared the open fields. The wind swept across the landscape, stirring the dry grass and sending dust into the air. The ground beneath them was cracked, parched, as though the earth itself had been drained of its very essence. It wasn't long before they came to the well, a crumbling stone structure that had once served as the heart of the town. It was surrounded by an eerie stillness, the air thick with the smell of decay. The stones of the well were cracked, weathered by time and neglect, and the faintest trace of something dark seemed to seep from the cracks, as if the well itself were alive with some malignant force. Sarah's throat tightened as she approached. She could feel the pull of it, the magnetic force of the well, calling to her. It wasn't a call of water, of life, but something far darker, something that fed on thirst. The wind howled around them, and Sarah shivered despite the heat of the day. Thomas stopped just short of the well and glanced at her. "I don't know if we should go any closer," he said, his voice trembling. "There's something wrong here, Sarah. You can feel it, can't you?" Sarah nodded, her heart pounding. It was a feeling she couldn't shake, a creeping unease that settled into her bones, telling her that something terrible lay just beneath the surface of the well. Something waiting. Watching, she stepped forward, unable to resist the pull any longer. The closer she got to the well, the more the air thickened. The smell of rot became overpowering, and a faint sound, like the faintest of whispers, rose from the depths. Thomas grabbed her arm, stopping her. "Sarah, please. Don't," but it was too late. She could no longer hear him. The world around her had faded, replaced by the whispering sound that seemed to seep from the earth itself. The thirst. The hunger. It was calling to her with a sudden burst of strength. She pulled away from Thomas's grasp and approached the edge of the well. Her legs shook, and her breath caught in her throat as she peered down into the darkness. There was nothing to see, just an endless void. But she could feel it, the weight of something far below, pressing against the stone walls, waiting. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and her head began to spin. The thirst in the air was palpable now, suffocating. She could feel it deep inside her, gnawing at her insides, urging her to drink from the well, to feed. Without thinking, she reached down, her fingers brushing the edge of the well. The moment her skin made contact, a shock of cold ran through her entire body, freezing her to the core. Her vision blurred, and for a split second, she thought she saw something deep within the well, something moving, something alive. "Sarah!" Thomas shouted, his voice desperate. But she couldn't move. She couldn't look away. The whispers intensified, filling her mind, drowning out everything else. The thirst, it wasn't just the land, the town, it was her too. It was a part of her now, feeding on her every thought, every breath. Her mouth went dry, and she could taste it, taste the blood that had been promised, and then, just as quickly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The world around her snapped back into focus, and she stumbled back from the well, gasping for air. Thomas caught her, his hands gripping her shoulders tightly. "Sarah, what happened? Are you all right?" She could barely respond, her mind still swirling with the remnants of the dark pull from the well. I don't know," she whispered, shaking her head. "There's something down there, something waiting for us." Thomas's face paled, and he turned to the well with a look of fear in his eyes. "I've never seen it like that. I knew something was wrong, but I never imagined." Before Sarah could respond, a soft thud echoed from the depths of the well. It was barely audible, but it was there. It was a sound of movement, of something stirring beneath the earth. "Get away from it," Thomas shouted, pulling her back with a sudden force. "We need to leave. Now." But as they stepped away from the well, Sarah glanced back one last time. The dark shape in the depths of the well had shifted, and she swore she saw something watching them, eyes glistening like water in the dark. "We're too late," she murmured, the weight of the truth settling over her. "It's awake." Chapter 6. The First Offering. The days that followed their visit to the well passed in a blur, each one more suffocating than the last. The air in Aylmsford had thickened, laden with the scent of decay and rot that seemed to emanate from the land itself. The drought persisted, but it was no longer the only thing that hung over the town like a dark shroud. The well, and the thing that stirred within it, had become an unspoken presence, an unholy reality they could no longer ignore. Sarah had tried to push the events of that day from her mind, but they lingered in every corner of her thoughts, whispering, clawing. She hadn't been able to sleep since. The hunger was growing, and she could feel it in her bones, the desperate pull, the gnawing need that reached into her very core. The thirst had taken on a new meaning now. It was more than just a physical craving. It was something far darker, far more insidious. As the days dragged on, Sarah found herself avoiding the well, though the pull remained, an invisible tether that seemed to bind her to the cursed place. She couldn't help it. The thirst was too powerful, and every day that passed made it worse. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the empty streets, Thomas came to her door again. His face was drawn, eyes shadowed with sleeplessness and worry. "It's getting worse," he said before she could even ask. "People are starting to disappear." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Disappear? What do you mean?" He nodded grimly, glancing over his shoulder as if checking for any unseen ears. "I'm talking about real disappearances. People just vanishing. And it's not just the thirst anymore. There's something else, something darker, that's pulling them away." She swallowed hard. "What's happening, Thomas? What are we supposed to do?" "I don't know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I think we need to make an offering." The words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. Sarah's pulse quickened, her breath shallow. She had heard the old tales, the ones whispered around the campfires, the ones told only in the dead of night. There had always been rumors about the well, about the old gods of the land and the blood that had been spilled in its name. But she had never believed them. Not until now. "An offering," she echoed, her throat dry. What kind of offering? Thomas hesitated, looking down at his feet as though ashamed. The well, it's hungry, Sarah. It's been starving for centuries, and now it's awake. It wants more than water. It wants blood. And if we don't give it something, if we don't feed it, it will take us all. Sarah's stomach turned, her mind reeling at the horror of it. No, she whispered, shaking her head. I can't. I won't. But Thomas's eyes, desperate and wide with fear, met hers. You don't understand. The town is already lost. People are dying, Sarah. The well has already taken too much. If we don't act, it will consume everything. We're the last ones who can stop it. Her mind raced, her thoughts a tangled mess of confusion and terror. She had never believed in the supernatural, had never given credence to old superstitions. But now, as she looked into Thomas's eyes, she saw the truth. The well, the thing beneath it, was real, and it was awake. And it wasn't going to stop until it had claimed everything. I can't do this, she whispered, her hands trembling. I can't give it what it wants. Thomas stepped closer, his voice urgent. We have no choice. It's not just thirst anymore. The well is feeding on fear, on desperation. We have to give it something, or it will keep taking. People are already turning mad, Sarah. They're drinking from the well, and they're not coming back. Sarah felt the nausea rise in her throat. She could hear the echo of those whispers again, that hunger, that insatiable need. The town was already drowning in it. But she couldn't give in. She couldn't feed whatever was lurking beneath the earth, but as the words left her lips, a scream tore through the air, a terrible, shrill cry that cut through the stillness of the night. Sarah's heart stopped. It came from the outskirts of town, from the direction of the well. Thomas's eyes widened in fear. We're too late, he whispered, his voice strained. It's taken someone else. Without another word, he turned and ran, and Sarah followed without thinking, her feet pounding against the dry earth. The town was alive with the sound of frantic footsteps, of doors slamming shut, of desperate whispers. They had heard the cry too. When they reached the edge of town, they saw it. A figure, stumbling toward them through the dust, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. She was gasping for breath, her body trembling. Ellen. Sarah called, rushing toward her. What happened? What's going on? Ellen's gaze locked onto Sarah's, and for a moment, she seemed to recognize her. But then her eyes glazed over, as though something had taken hold of her from within. They took her, Ellen murmured, her voice hoarse. The well, it took her. It's hungry, and it's coming for all of us. Ellen collapsed in Sarah's arms, her body limp, the light fading from her eyes. The thirst had claimed her, just as it had claimed so many others. Sarah looked at Thomas, her eyes wide with horror. It's already too late, she whispered. We can't stop it. Thomas's face was ashen. The well is already feeding, Sarah. And it won't stop until it has claimed everything. The last rays of the setting sun disappeared behind the hills, and the town of Aylmsford was left in darkness, as the whispers from the well rose once more, louder than before. The hunger had begun, and it wouldn't stop. Chapter 7. The Offering. The next morning dawned without the hope of salvation. The sun, hidden behind a curtain of dust and haze, seemed little more than a weak spectre in the sky. The air remained dry and oppressive, a reminder of the town's suffocating thirst. Sarah stood in the small, dimly lit room of the inn, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. The weight of the past few days hung over her like a heavy cloak. Ellen's death had shattered any remaining illusions Sarah had about the town's fate. The well had claimed its first true victim, but she knew it wouldn't stop there. The thirst that plagued Aylmsford had become something far more dangerous. It was no longer just the land that suffered, it was the people. The curse had taken root, and now it demanded payment. She turned away from the window, where the parched landscape stretched endlessly, a barren desert of twisted trees and cracked earth. The town seemed smaller from up here, the buildings hunched together like forgotten remnants of a long-lost civilization. The silence had become unbearable. People no longer spoke of the drought. They spoke of something darker. Something that could not be stopped. Thomas was downstairs, his presence an anchor in this sea of dread. He had been with her since the beginning, but even his steady gaze had begun to betray a flicker of doubt. He was no longer the man she had first met. The well had broken something in him, just as it had in everyone who lived in Aylmsford. Sarah descended the narrow staircase, her feet dragging against the dust-covered boards. Thomas was at the table, his face drawn and pale, as though he hadn't slept in days. The lines beneath his eyes were deeper than she remembered, and his hands trembled slightly as he held a cup of water that he had no intention of drinking. "There's no use in waiting," Thomas said without looking up. His voice was flat, devoid of the hope he had once carried. "We can't outrun this anymore." Sarah swallowed hard, her throat still dry despite the water she had consumed earlier. "We have to do something. We can't just sit here and let it take everything." "I've been thinking," Thomas said, his gaze still fixed on the cup. "We need to make an offering." The words struck Sarah like a blow. She had hoped that he had changed his mind, that he had come to realize the horror of what they were suggesting. But now it was clear. Thomas had fallen as deep into the well's grip as everyone else. "An offering," she repeated, her voice tight. You mean we actually have to feed it?" He finally looked up, his eyes dark and hollow. "It's the only way to stop it. To stop it from taking anyone else. The well feeds on blood, on life. If we don't give it what it wants, it'll keep taking." "No," Sarah said, shaking her head. We can't give it what it wants. That's murder." Thomas's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, he seemed to be fighting something inside himself. "It's not murder. It's survival. People are dying, Sarah. People are disappearing. We have to give it something, anything, or it will consume us all." Sarah felt a sickening wave of despair crash over her. She had never believed in the supernatural, never believed that something so dark could have power over the world. But now, she could feel it, feel the pull of the well, the insatiable thirst that had taken root in this town. And it was only a matter of time before it came for her. "Who would we offer?" she asked, her voice trembling. Thomas's gaze hardened. "I'm afraid the offering has already been chosen." The words hung in the air, and Sarah's blood ran cold. She knew, even before he said it, what he meant. "Me," Thomas whispered. "I'll do it." Sarah's heart stopped. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "You can't. You're not the one who's supposed to." "It's the only way," Thomas interrupted, his voice uncharacteristically sharp. If I don't go, the town is finished. We'll all be swallowed whole by the thirst. She could feel the reality of his words sinking in. There was no escaping this. There was no way out. The town was already lost, and it was too late to turn back. They had been brought to the edge of the abyss, and there was only one way to stop the darkness from swallowing everything. But even as she tried to convince herself that it was the right choice, something twisted in her gut. It felt wrong. It felt as though she was being pulled into something she couldn't escape, a bargain with the devil. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice breaking. "We can find another way." Thomas smiled sadly, his eyes filled with a resigned understanding. "There is no other way, Sarah. The well has already claimed so many lives. It's only a matter of time before it claims more. We can't let it take the whole town." She looked at him, her mind spinning. She didn't want to lose him. She didn't want to be alone in this nightmare. But as she met his gaze, she saw the same darkness there that she had seen in the eyes of so many others, the same madness, the same surrender to the thirst. "It's already begun," he said quietly. "We can't stop it now." The door to the inn creaked open, and a cold wind blew in, sending a shiver down Sarah's spine. She knew what was coming next. It was inevitable. Thomas stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. "I'll go to the well," he said, as if speaking to himself. "It will end tonight. For all of us." Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come. There was no protest left, no fight in her. All that remained was the hollow ache, the emptiness that had settled deep within her. And then, before she could stop him, Thomas was gone, walking out into the dying light of the afternoon. Sarah stood in the doorway, staring at his retreating figure, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what was about to happen. She couldn't stop him. No one could. The town was beyond saving. The well had already claimed its prize, and now it would claim him too. Chapter 8. The Thirst Grows. The moon was a faint, sickly sliver in the sky when Sarah left the inn. The air had grown colder, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones, and a thick fog had begun to crawl from the edges of the town, curling around the buildings like a predator stalking its prey. The night seemed endless, and the stillness was unnerving, broken only by the soft rustling of the leaves in the trees. She didn't know how long she had been standing there, watching Thomas disappear into the mist. Minutes. Hours. Time had lost all meaning. The thirst, the hunger, was all-consuming, a gnawing presence in the back of her mind, pushing her forward even as every step felt heavier than the last. The streets were deserted, save for the occasional flicker of movement in the shadows. The townspeople had retreated into their homes, locking their doors, hiding from the darkness that had settled in their hearts. They knew what had to be done. The offering. The price. It was only a matter of time before the town was swallowed whole, consumed by the very thirst that had been their undoing. But Sarah couldn't stop. She couldn't just let him go. Thomas had made the sacrifice, but was it enough? Would it end the curse? Or had it only begun? She had to know. She had to see it for herself. She moved through the fog, her footsteps muffled by the thick air, her heart pounding in her chest. The well was on the outskirts of town, near the abandoned chapel. It had once been a place of worship, a place where the townspeople had gathered for comfort, but now it stood as little more than a crumbling ruin, its once beautiful stonework now eroded by the years of neglect. The town had abandoned its faith long ago, just as it had abandoned all hope. Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps as she approached the well. Its outline loomed before her, a dark, yawning mouth waiting to swallow her whole. She had to fight the urge to turn away, to run back to the safety of the inn, but she couldn't. Not anymore. She had seen too much. She had felt it, the thirst that had taken root in the very soil of Aylmsford. It wasn't just the land that was dying. It was the people. She reached the well, her eyes straining in the dim light. The air around it felt thick, oppressive, as though the very earth itself was holding its breath. The stench of decay hung in the air, a sickening odor that reminded her of rot, of death. She didn't want to look into the well, didn't want to see the thing that had cursed them all, but she couldn't stop herself. There, at the edge of the well, was Thomas. His body lay sprawled on the ground, his eyes wide open, staring up at the sky. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. He was still alive, but barely. Sarah stumbled forward, her hands reaching out toward him, but she stopped short as a low, guttural growl echoed from within the well. She froze, her blood running cold. Something was down there, something that was waiting. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice shaking. "What happened?" He didn't respond. His body trembled, as though caught in the grip of some unseen force. His eyes flickered, but they didn't seem to focus on her. They were distant, glazed over, as though he was looking through her, past her, into something else entirely. Sarah knelt beside him, her hand trembling as it hovered over his. He was burning with fever, his skin flushed and slick with sweat. His breathing became more erratic, each gasp a struggle, as though the air itself was being stolen from him. "Thomas," she repeated, her voice desperate now. "Talk to me. Please." His lips parted, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might speak, but instead, a strange, hollow sound emerged from his throat. A rasping, inhuman noise, like the creaking of ancient wood or the groan of the earth itself. It sent a shiver down her spine, and then, as if his body couldn't bear it any longer, he reached out toward the well. His hand trembled as he grasped the edge, pulling himself closer to the dark abyss. "Don't," Sarah cried, pulling him back with all her strength. "Don't go back there." But it was too late. The well seemed to pulse, to throb with life. The ground beneath them trembled, and Sarah felt a sudden, crushing pressure in her chest, as though the air itself was being pushed from her lungs. The thirst was here. Thomas's eyes flickered open, but there was nothing human left in them. They were black, dark as night, empty and hollow. And then he began to speak, his voice not his own, a deep, resonant growl that seemed to come from somewhere far beneath the earth. "Sarah," the voice was distorted, as though it had traveled through miles of rock and soil. "Sarah, you don't understand." The words twisted her insides, pulling at something deep within her, something primal. The thirst, the hunger, it was speaking to her. It was calling to her. "Thomas, please," she begged, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, come back to me." But there was no response. Thomas's body shuddered violently, and then he began to fall forward, his arms outstretched toward the well. Sarah tried to catch him, but he was too heavy, too far gone. Her fingers brushed against his skin, and in that instant, a surge of cold, dark energy shot through her, sending a shock of pain through her entire body. The well had claimed him. As his body vanished into the darkness, the fog around them began to swirl, and the ground beneath her feet gave way. The thirst had been satisfied, for now. But Sarah knew, deep in her soul, that it would return. It always did. The curse was never truly over, and in the distance, she heard the soft whisper of the wind, a mournful voice calling out from the well, "Thirst, forever, thirst." Chapter 9. The Unseen Price. The morning came slowly, as though the town of Aylmsford had forgotten what the sun looked like. The thick fog lingered, shrouding the streets in a pall of heavy, suffocating silence. Sarah stood alone by the well, her body trembling from the remnants of the strange, unearthly force that had gripped her just moments before. The weight of the night, the knowledge that Thomas was lost to the darkness, pressed upon her, threatening to crush her spirit. She had failed him. And yet, she knew deep down that she was no longer just a bystander in this cursed town. She had become a part of its nightmare. The ground beneath her feet felt soft, almost damp, as though the earth itself had soaked in the sorrow of centuries. Sarah could taste the bitterness in the air, the lingering aftertaste of something dark and ancient that she could no longer escape. She had always heard the whispers, but now they were louder, clearer, echoing in her mind like the thundering rush of water in a river that would never stop. She couldn't stay here. But where could she go? The townspeople had long since retreated to their homes, hiding behind bolted doors, pretending they hadn't heard the growl, the dark promise of the well that called for them all. They had been waiting for someone else to make the offering, to quench the thirst that had been plaguing the land for generations. But now, the thirst had found a new target. Sarah's fingers twitched as the memories of the night before surged back into her mind. The well. Thomas. His desperate, hollow plea. She had tried to save him, to pull him from the edge, but the force had been too strong. She hadn't understood the curse, hadn't known what it truly meant until now. The thirst was not just a drought, not just a lack of water. It was a hunger, a need that had existed for centuries, gnawing away at the town, at its people, consuming them piece by piece. The well had been their salvation, their damnation. It had taken them all, and now it wanted more, but Sarah wasn't sure she had the strength to face it. She felt like an empty shell, hollowed out by the sheer terror that had clawed at her soul the night before. Thomas was gone. And yet, she could feel his presence, a shadow lingering in the corners of her mind. The town had lived in fear for too long. Now, it was her turn to face what had been hidden in the dark. She turned away from the well, her legs unsteady beneath her as she walked back toward the center of town. She had no plan, no clear purpose, but she couldn't just stand there and wait for whatever was coming next. Not anymore. The streets were eerily quiet as Sarah walked, the only sound her footsteps echoing against the cobblestones. She had grown used to the silence, to the ever-present emptiness that seemed to seep from the very walls of Aylmsford. But today, it felt different. It felt as though the silence was watching her, listening for the faintest sign of weakness. She passed the crumbling buildings, the weather-beaten shutters of the houses that seemed to sag under the weight of their own history. The town had been beautiful once, or so the old stories said. But now, it was a ghost of its former self. A town hollowed out by fear, by loss, by thirst. And then she saw him. At first, she thought it was an illusion. But no, he was standing at the edge of the square, just beyond the faded sign that marked the town's main street. His face was half hidden in shadow, but his presence was unmistakable. The stranger. He hadn't changed. The same dark coat, the same eyes that seemed to gleam with a knowing that unsettled her every time she looked at him. He was just standing there, watching her with an expression that was impossible to read. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat, and for a moment, she wondered if she had imagined him all along, but no. He was real. And he was here for a reason. "You're still here," Sarah said, her voice rough from the emotions that swirled inside her. "I thought you left." The stranger tilted his head slightly, his eyes glinting with a hint of something she couldn't place. "I never truly leave, Sarah," he said, his voice smooth, almost too calm. "I am always here, watching, waiting." "Waiting for what?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to control it. "For the thirst," he replied simply, as though it was the most obvious thing in the world. Her heart skipped a beat. You mean the curse?" "The curse is only a part of it," he said. "It is a manifestation of something much older, much darker. The land itself is sick. The people, too." She took a step back, instinctively wanting to put distance between herself and the man who had already taken so much from her. "Then why are you still here? Why didn't you leave with Thomas? He made the sacrifice." The stranger's lips curled into a faint, almost amused smile. "Do you think that sacrifice was enough? No. You cannot quench the thirst with such simple offerings. It has no end, no mercy. It only takes, and takes, and takes." "Then why did you help us?" Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "What was your part in all of this?" "I only did what needed to be done," the stranger said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I gave you the truth. But whether you can bear it is another matter entirely." "What does that mean?" Sarah demanded, her voice rising. The stranger's gaze flickered briefly to the well in the distance before returning to her. "The price of this curse is far greater than you realize. You will see soon enough, Sarah. You will see what is waiting for you." She felt a chill run through her, a coldness that settled deep within her chest. She opened her mouth to ask him more, but before she could speak, he was gone, vanishing into the thick fog that had begun to creep over the town once more. And with his disappearance, the thirst returned. A sudden, unbearable dryness filled Sarah's throat, a sensation as though her very blood was being drained from her body. Her vision blurred, and she staggered, clutching her chest as if trying to hold herself together. The thirst had found her again, and this time, it was not so easy to ignore. It was close now. Closer than ever, and Sarah knew, with a sickening certainty, that there was no escaping it. Not now. Not ever. Chapter 10. The Final Offering. The town of Elmsford had become a place of shadows, a place where time and memory blurred into a single, relentless moment. The fog rolled in thick as ever, swallowing the streets whole, and Sarah felt the oppressive weight of its presence more than ever before. It felt as though the air itself had turned to lead, pushing down on her chest with every breath she took. The thirst was closer now. Not just a thirst for water, but a thirst for something far darker, something she could no longer deny. She stood at the center of the town, her eyes scanning the ghostly outline of the buildings around her. The stranger's words echoed in her mind, each syllable like a drumbeat that quickened her pulse. "You cannot quench the thirst with such simple offerings. It has no end, no mercy." Those words had haunted her, gnawing at her sanity, until she could no longer ignore the truth of them. There was no escape from the curse. There never had been, but still, she had to try. For the town. For herself. Even for Thomas, whose face lingered in the corners of her thoughts, a reminder of everything they had lost. Everything she had lost. The well stood before her, its dark mouth yawning wide, beckoning her with an unnatural pull. It was here, in the shadow of this ancient, cursed monument, that the final decision would be made. She could feel it in her bones, that the end was near. The end of the town. The end of this cycle of thirst. The end of her own torment. The air smelled of decay, of old earth, of things long dead. The wind whispered to her, carrying with it the voices of the past, the cries of those who had come before her, who had made their own sacrifices, their own offerings. She could almost hear their desperate pleas, their last moments of horror as they, too, realized the truth too late. Sarah walked forward, her steps slow and deliberate, her eyes fixed on the well that had claimed so many lives. The thirst inside her was unbearable now, a gnawing hunger that reached deep into her chest, hollowing her out from the inside. She couldn't ignore it anymore. She couldn't pretend that it wasn't part of her now. She had to give in. There was no other choice. With trembling hands, Sarah reached into the folds of her coat and pulled out the small, ancient relic that the stranger had given her, the stone that had once belonged to the well, the stone that had been a key to the curse itself. Its surface was cold to the touch, as though it had been frozen in time, and the strange markings etched into its surface seemed to pulse with an energy all their own. The well called to her, louder now, urging her to step closer. The darkness within its depths seemed to reach out, as if it had a life of its own. Sarah could feel its hunger, its insatiable thirst, crawling under her skin. This was it. This was the moment. She dropped the stone into the well, her fingers brushing the cold, smooth surface as it disappeared into the blackness below. For a moment, nothing happened. The world held its breath, as though waiting for some unseen force to awaken. And then, as if on cue, the ground trembled beneath her feet, a low, rumbling growl that echoed through the earth, through her very soul. The thirst answered. It wasn't a voice that spoke to her, but a presence, a force, ancient and terrible, that filled the space around her. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, the fear rising within her, but she stood firm. She had come this far. She had no choice but to face whatever came next. The fog thickened, swirling around her like a living thing, closing in on her as the ground beneath her feet cracked and shifted. The sky above seemed to darken, casting a shadow over the entire town. She could feel the weight of all the lost souls who had come before her pressing down on her, their mournful wails reverberating in the very air. The thirst had always been there. It had always been waiting, and now it would claim its final offering. Sarah sank to her knees, her body shaking as she felt the darkness envelop her, swallowing her whole. Her vision blurred, her senses fading as the curse took its final toll. She could hear the whispers, the soft voices of those who had been taken, calling to her, pulling her deeper into the abyss. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The fog lifted, the ground stilled, the thirst, for a brief moment, seemed to recede, its terrible hunger sated. And Sarah felt the weight of it all lift from her shoulders, the burden that had consumed her for so long finally released. But it was not peace that filled her soul. It was emptiness, for the town, too, had been taken. The curse had claimed its last victim. The well, that insatiable force of nature, was silent now. Its dark hunger had been satisfied, for now Sarah rose to her feet, her body weak but standing. The town of Aylmsford lay still before her, the once thriving community reduced to a mere shell of its former self. The buildings were empty, the streets deserted. The town had been consumed by the very thing it had once feared. She turned and walked away, her footsteps heavy in the quiet aftermath. The thirst was gone, but it had left its mark, carved deep into the soul of the land. And though Sarah had done what was necessary to end it, she knew that the price had been steep. No one would remember the town of Aylmsford. No one would speak of the curse that had haunted it for centuries. But Sarah would remember. She would carry its weight with her, wherever she went, and though the thirst had been quenched, the scars it left would never fade.